Somerset Cyber Group, which is a group of 3 businesses, CETSAT, PC Comms, and a company called Blue Loop. Durgan is going to be talking to us today about obviously how we can keep our systems safe. We're obviously changing the way that we work, working from home, the normal safety nets and systems that we would have in place in the workplace are not necessarily in place at home. So Durgan is going to give us a few hints and tips on how to make sure that our cyber systems are all fit and healthy for working from home. So Durgan, I'm going to pass over to you. I'm going to put it on speaker view, and just to let everybody know that we are recording this so that we can show back. So if you don't want to be on video, you can obviously switch your camera off if you wish. Durgan, over to you.
Thank you very much. Well, good morning, everyone. I hope you're all well. It's very testing times, and as Alistair, or as you've joined for, I'm hopefully going to give a bit of an overview of our thoughts as to how, in these unprecedented times, you might help tell your company and your colleagues from compromise. I will just bring up a presentation. Can you all see that?
Yep.
No, lovely. Okay, so just a very quick background on the Somerset Cyber Group. So as Alistair just intimated, we are a consortium which was set up last year out of Hinckley supply chain. So the cyber threats into the supply chain are of critical importance to ensure that the project is delivered. And ultimately, we have come together believing that technology is better together and to deliver some components of cybersecurity for organizations within the supply chain. There are some 4,000 companies in the supply chain. Yeah, certainly as a minimum, the supply chain will eventually have to meet with the government standard cyber essentials, which I will extend a bit more information on about later. However, as a consortium, we've kept it really simple. We have 2 products which are cyber essentials, so to 2 different levels, cyber essentials and cyber essentials plus, and cyber education. Some look at it that our staff, our colleagues are the weakest link, and we very much look at it from the different lens of our people are our greatest line of defense. So I'll talk about cyber safe and cyber education shortly. I thought I'd start with the top 5 UK cyber threats. You may be aware that there has been an unprecedented rise in cybercrime over the last 2 months. Phishing attacks are up 600%. And obviously it's very key that as businesses, we keep abreast of those. Over the last few weeks, I think it's fair to say that the majority of the world has moved to remote working and has paid little attention perhaps to the security of systems, whilst obviously focusing on getting people working. So I hope and believe that companies will now start to take a bit more credence to cybersecurity and the risks which they pose to our businesses. So the top 5 threats currently as designated, this is back from March, I hasten to add. I don't think it's changed much in the last few weeks, but the top 5 threats are currently as follows. Targeted ransomware. So for those of you who are unaware of ransomware, ransomware essentially is a form of attack which renders either systems useless or data inaccessible. So essentially having to pay a fine or pay a ransom to recover systems. Now obviously being criminals, there's no guarantee that even having paid a ransom that you will gain access back to systems and data. Certainly in the last 2 weeks, I'm aware of a Somerset business having been attacked to the tune of £500,000. So it is happening still, and it's increasing. IoT devices come in at number 4. So IoT is colloquially called the Internet of Things. And these are devices which are not your traditional PCs, servers, laptops, tablets, but these are the devices around our homes and around our businesses which are connected to the internet for monitoring, for remote control and administration. And certainly these devices historically have been built for functionality and not for security. So obviously over the last years, vendors, manufacturers have come up to scratch, but certainly we are responsible for maintaining them, changing default passwords and so on. Data breaches and compromised credentials. So arguably, we can do very little to stop these things. These are invariably attacks against large suppliers, large websites where they have hundreds of thousands of members accessing them, and their systems are compromised, and our passwords and credentials are stolen and ultimately sold on the dark web. Now, we'll talk about passwords again shortly, but ultimately, the way to reduce the risk from this is to ensure that we have unique passwords on every website, so that if our credentials are compromised on any individual website, the likelihood of those credentials being used elsewhere by criminals to access our systems and our data will be minimized. Supply chain attacks, obviously very important for the Hinckley supply chain, and all of us in business, ultimately, we all operate in supply chains, and criminals have become very adept in identifying people within supply chains. We're very free with our information on social media about who we've won contracts with and so on. And ultimately, if an organized gang or criminal gang wish to gain access to a target organization, more often than not, they may go in through or attempt to go through their supply chain and therefore bypass security credentials. Within my own world, I operate within sort of building management systems, as an example. So around Canary Wharf, banks and large organizations, they're very secure. You can't get in the building without booking in days in advance and so on. But actually, engineers are going into these sites, updating systems and so on. So that's a very common method, for example, for criminal gangs to gain access into banks and buildings, and ultimately as all. Often these things are drive-by, but actually increasingly they are very sophisticated and targeted. And finally, the number one cyber threat to us all today is phishing, which is email-borne attacks which will attempt to gain access, gain credentials through a number of different mediums, but ultimately coming through email. Incidentally, this morning, you may have been aware on the news that the National Cybersecurity Centre actually launched a new campaign for working at home about how to protect our staff and protect our families ultimately. And just a small list there about passwords. So as I suggested, create separate passwords for different accounts, strong passwords. So guidance changed about 12 months ago. We had a glut of essentially complex passwords. So the guidance was for about 18 months complexity, which sadly from an IT services perspective gave us an absolute headache because no one could remember their passwords because they were so complex and systems were forcing them to be. So essentially the guidance today is very much to have a passphrase, 3 random words, a bit of complexity, and by that what I mean is symbols and numbers, substituting characters, but ultimately make it something memorable. And if you can get into a routine of having a form for different websites, then that's a good thing. Obviously, passwords, saving them, you may use a password safe, which I do personally. People often ask me, which one do you recommend? There are so many out there, and ultimately they are all susceptible to compromise. So I would suggest that it would be remiss of me to suggest one for you, but ultimately it's all about doing your due diligence, finding which ones you're happy with, and update your devices and turn backups on. So our top 10 tips for working remotely are as follows. And I'll go through each of them in a little bit of detail. So education, as I suggested at the start, in these, notwithstanding these days, education of our staff is so critical in protecting our organisations from cyber threat. I often align this to using products like Microsoft Office and the like. So we all upgrade our software on a regular basis, but very few people actually are trained to exploit the new capabilities in software, and thus they're not as productive as they could be. And yet we're making these investments into software. In the same way, we cannot expect our people, our staff, our colleagues, or indeed our families to protect our systems if we actually haven't educated them. So top 10, number one, our advice is train our people. And I'll hopefully give you an idea of how to do that shortly. Email security. There are many flavors of this. If we put it into football leagues, there are some premiership teams out there, organizations, to give you a few names that you can go off and investigate. Mimecast, Message Labs, which is a Symantec product, I would suggest are probably the global leaders. They are pretty expensive, but extremely thorough and comprehensive in their capabilities. And then rolling down through them, if you're using systems like Microsoft Office 365 or Gmail or G Suite, indeed both of these systems also have email security platforms which add an additional premium, but add an extra layer of security and actually filter out a great deal of compromise coming towards us. Patching, I mentioned this with IoT devices, but patching is so key, especially when working remotely. A good example of this, only yesterday, is one of our clients phoned up. They're working remotely and accessing a remote hosted server, and the connection kept dropping out. So not only would I suggest that we patch our systems from a Windows update or an iOS update, but actually when we're supporting systems, the first thing we should do is actually patch it. And yesterday, the problem one of my colleagues experienced was actually a network card driver, which was 4 or 5 years out of date. And the connection just kept dropping. So the remote session would freeze, they would lose connection, and it would automatically reconnect, but it affected their productivity so much, bearing in mind that they're working on a home PC connecting to a business system. So obviously, responsibility is not held by the company for patching that system and maintaining it. So if we have issues, either having issues where there are issues with the system, with productivity of the system, to patch the system, to update drivers is a very positive thing. And as I suggested, resolve the issue so that it was stable all day yesterday. But obviously, the majority of patches and updates these days are for security. Probably 5 to 10 years ago, it was all about functionality and features. So you might do an Office update with Microsoft Office, and it would add additional capability to the product. Now, whilst there are still productivity and benefits to the applications, the majority are for security. So certainly when working on home machines, I can't stress enough how important it is to ask our colleagues to do that when working on their own equipment. The next is next generation anti-malware. So antivirus has been around for as long as I've been working in technology, but over the last couple of years, because of the evolving capability and bandwidth of the internet, next generation anti-malware essentially will connect to a web service in real time and scan for malware and viruses in real time. So essentially, no longer do we have big downloads of anti-malware databases that we have to maintain. Systems are constantly online and constantly connecting to the global networks of anti-malware providers. And therefore, if a new piece of malware is seen abroad, within seconds, that will protect you and your organization, your systems from it in the UK. And therefore, I'd suggest, if at all possible, extending your business anti-malware to your colleagues on their home equipment is a very good thing. So it just protects that any data which is being used on personal equipment, or BYOD, bring your own device, is a good thing. So next-gen anti-malware, I would suggest, is absolutely key for any organization operating today. The next is multi-factor authentication. So when I mentioned about phishing being the largest cyber threat in the UK today, the majority of phishing attempts are attempting to extract credentials from the user. Certainly, we have run tests on our clients, and indeed our colleagues, constantly attempting to perform what are called phishing attacks against them. And this is essentially where someone gets taken off to a website which looks very similar to what, I'll use the example of Microsoft Office 365. So this is obviously heavily used platform in the UK, and certainly a lot of the systems of online apps and systems are now capable of two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication. But if you don't have those systems deployed, then essentially all we need is a username and password to access our accounts. So ultimately, multi-factor authentication adds an extra layer which is much harder for criminals to access. They generally come in the form of either a text message, an email. So essentially, I will attempt to log in and I will either be sent a text message or an email, or an authenticator app, which I may have on a smartphone, which will give me a code to enter in once I've put my main credentials. And this obviously means that whilst a criminal or hacker may be able to get your credentials to this particular platform, they haven't got that extra bit of information to gain full access to your account. So if you have a look at all of your accounts online and that of your staff, ask them, well, obviously, depending on what systems, the majority do have multi-factor available, and it just needs to be set up. It can be a slightly arduous process depending upon the system, but obviously if it's a critical system to you and it's got, most importantly, the crown jewels, critical information for you, your business, or that of your customers, then obviously it's a very worthwhile thing to shore up. The next is backup. Obviously we have increasingly over the last years stampeded to the cloud. Office 365 is a good example of this, where we are storing not only our emails, but business data, sensitive information. And often these systems in themselves are not necessarily backing up the data. So if they are compromised, we need to have a plan as to how, in the event of compromise, we would recover that data to a working state so that people can gain access and become productive again. So backups, my suggestion for this is that you don't back up to a local USB hard drive. Criminals, bless them, they are sophisticated and they are very clever. And increasingly, systems or malware will scour a network, a system, to find what devices are connected to it, to see if backups, either natively just copying files onto them, or indeed if there's some backup software in place on a host, it will search for this and find the backups, and also try and encrypt those, for example, rendering the backup inaccessible for recovery. So very important that you have a strategy for backup, and most importantly, tying into business continuity, what are the plans that we enact in the event of a situation occurring to recover our systems and our people to a working state? So those two are very much combined in their efforts. Business continuity has very much come to the fore during the COVID-19 crisis, pandemic. I think working from home, one could suggest, and enacting that working remotely in itself is a business continuity plan. So yeah, having good robust backups which are either online and encrypted and disparate from your systems, or indeed having them separated from your host machines, so that in the event of compromise they are accessible. But as I say, just further on business continuity essentially takes disaster recovery planning a step further. It's looking at people, process and the technology, not just the technology itself. So people, who needs to enact business continuity, who needs to access data and systems in the event of a disaster, and ultimately what systems are critical to us, because then you can prioritize how you bring those systems back online. And as I say, sadly, it's happening still. I mentioned about one organisation I'm aware of in Somerset, but I'm aware of outside of Somerset a number of organisations continually being compromised. So it's happening, and it's happening at an alarming rate. The next is VPN. Now, you may have heard a lot about VPN, and they are both good and bad in the respect of the context of working remotely. And the reason I say that is there is good VPN and there is bad VPN. Now, good VPN is a system which will connect you invariably to an appliance which in itself is a security appliance. That will essentially mean that if you're working on a laptop, on wireless, it may be your own wireless, it could be that you're daisy chaining on someone else, that traffic is encrypted between the device upon which you're working and the data source that you're trying to access. The reason I suggest that it's good and bad is because traditional VPN used to terminate on servers and bypass firewalls, which would be scanning the traffic which you're putting through. So if a home device, using the example of people using their home equipment, is bypassing the firewall, essentially the firewall is enabled to actually scan and protect the network from the traffic going through it. It cannot actually see the contents of the encrypted traffic. So be careful about using a VPN and ensure that it's connecting to a security appliance rather than connecting to a server. And that way you have multiple layers of protection, protecting your data and indeed protecting the endpoint, the device from which you're attempting to connect. The last two are cyber insurance. I mentioned about the organisation in Somerset. They had a £500,000 demand for ransom. They fortunately did have cyber insurance, and over the past years, I and my company have been called in to assist after a cyber event. It's a pretty frenetic time, as you might imagine, dependent upon the size of the organisation, the value of the data, the type of data, and the inaccessibility of systems. And certainly, dependent upon who provides your IT services, they may or may not have a robust approach to incident response when it comes to a cyber incident. Invariably, cyber insurance carries a response panel whereby the insurer will actually pay for an incident response team to come help and manage a cyber incident, so that essentially you can take a bit of a step back, focus on outbound marketing and communication with your customers, and you actually have a dedicated team to actually work on the incident and attempt to recover your systems to a working state. Bearing in mind you've got all the other things in place, the backups from which they can recover, but also from a containment perspective, they will also attempt to identify the source of the compromise and actually isolate it and so on. So instant response is key, and certainly a way of minimizing the risk and transferring that risk from our IT service providers, people such as ourselves, is to actually carry some form of insurance, which, as I say, I believe, I work with a number of insurers, and certainly in the last months, they have seen a very steep rise in cyber insurance. Finally, is Cyber Essentials. Again, this is one of the things, or in fact, this is the main thing that the Somerset Cyber Group was actually set to deliver. Cyber Essentials is a government scheme created to help organizations establish a baseline for cybersecurity. So a posture which demonstrates to board members, our staff, and most importantly, our customers and suppliers, that we are a safe place to do business. So Cyber Essentials is a process of essentially establishing a baseline of security covering internet connectivity, firewalls, security around desktop configuration, patch management, and anti-malware. So a number of those things I've already discussed, but it brings it together in a palatable format, which is easy to understand, digest, and most importantly, implement. Now, certainly I mention it in the respect of a certification. My advice is, and I'm happy to share it with Alistair and promote it, or for him to push it out beyond this, but essentially you can download the standard for free. If you don't require it for either contract award or for vanity, I see a number of people have it on the bottom of their emails. I think we do ourselves. If you don't require it for contract or award or vanity, then essentially you can implement the steps for free and not become certified, knowing yourself that you've done the good things, you've put them in place, and you have a better posture than perhaps your peers, your competition, and most importantly, to protect you from risk. So Cyber Essentials was created to reduce the risk of unsophisticated, untargeted attack by up to 80%. So it's the baseline that I would propose. There are 27 standards, cybersecurity standards recognized in the UK, and it is the bottom rung of the ladder. Now, I mentioned going back to education, some tools. There are a good number of tools out there. There are free tools that you can sign up to and get your staff working. The tool that we as an organization, as a consortium, push is a paid-for tool. However, they have a free 3-month trial, or not even a trial, it's a fully functioning system for COVID-19 for staff working from home. It's on your screen here, and I've got a link which I'll share with you in a second. But essentially, I would take the link in a second and share this and sign up in your organizations, share it with your staff, and give them some education when working from home. So the things there to note are social engineering, obviously, where we put so much information on social media about ourselves, our organizations, our customers, and so on. Just being careful and being mindful about what we put, essentially, which could be used to exploit us and our staff. So the link to share with you is coming now. So if you'd like to take that down, that's, as I say, it's a 3-month reduced system for COVID-19, but essentially it will give your staff and colleagues a flavour of some of the compromise attempts, why it's important to use, or things to do when using public Wi-Fi and so on. And as I mentioned, Cyber Essentials is a good standard, and I'll share with Alistair, as I say, the document, the framework which you can take into your organisation, use, have a look at. It's a good time to apply resource to it. Certainly, obviously, in these testing times where we have got some spare capacity with our resource, to focus on Cyber Essentials, and as I say, to look at our employees' systems at home, their state there. Are they using out-of-date operating systems, which sadly won't pass Cyber Essentials if you're not using Windows 10 now, or Windows 8, Windows 7 went end of life back in January. So it's essentially evolving constantly and will enable, as I say, good visibility at all levels of an organisation, but most importantly, make the board cognizant of its posture so that when it goes out there in the marketplace, it has confidence that it's a safe place to do business. So just to recap, I think I'm just 2 minutes over time. My basics are: identify your crown jewels, what systems are necessary and critical in your organisation for you to operate. Around those, implement a technical security layer, the backups, the anti-malware, and so on. But most importantly, train your staff. It's all about our staff. They are our greatest line of defence. And thank you very much. I hope that's been a useful bit of information. And certainly, if you've got any questions, please go ahead.
Excellent. Thank you, Durgan. I'll just ask you to stop sharing your screen, and then we can get everybody back into the room, so to speak.
How do I turn on technology? 2 seconds. Oh.
Should be at the top of your screen that you're sharing in the show. Stop sharing.
Excuse me, I do apologise. I can't get rid of this.
I think I can do it. There we go, done it. Right.
Thank you. Yeah, I've just got to it. Thank you.
That's okay. Okay, I'm going to unmute everybody. Thank you, Durgan. That was fascinating. I think there's a few things certainly that we can take away from there. It's good to hear that products like Mimecast are well regarded. I know that's what the Chamber used as part of their defence. And in terms of things like password management, I know you didn't mention names, but we use LastPass.
I do myself.
Well, yeah, it was recommended to me a while ago. I use it both professionally and personally, and actually, once you get used to a slightly different way of doing it, it's dead easy. So I would certainly, be happy to recommend those two products. Did anybody else have questions coming from that?
No, lots to think about, but no questions.
Yeah. Have you all sort of been listening to Durgan and thinking, oh gosh, there's lots of things certainly that we could put in place or would need to?
Training is key.
Training, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely something.
Yeah, and certainly, we see an awful lot of, phishing emails that will sneak through saying you need to contact me, or email me back on this, and they're spoofing email addresses all the time. So it's a very easy thing to slip, especially if you haven't necessarily got your normal working head on if you're working from home. So certainly that's something that we've seen a lot of, and you just need to be mindful and aware and up to speed on what those threats are. So yeah, definitely, Fran, I'd suggest training is a key to this.
Yeah, especially my 16-year-old son last week had a coronavirus stimulus payment email come through suggesting that he was capable of receiving £235 grant as an individual. They've obviously got a database and are just publishing it out there, and sadly people are being compromised and falling for it. Certainly just some stats actually that I got off GCHQ's website this morning. So they're in the UK, so this isn't global, but in the UK, in the last 3 weeks, they've brought down 471 fake online shops. So obviously people just going off and buying whatever. Obviously the criminals are looking at what's hot at the moment, setting up shops, taking people's money and obviously not delivering anything. 832 advanced fraudsters have been shut down, and 200 phishing websites which were hosted UK onshore. So you know, we look at this as it is a global problem in that obviously the internet has no borders. So sadly, a lot of compromise comes out of the Chinese, Russians, Iranians, and North Koreans. But ultimately, because people have so much time on their hands, sadly, you can buy your own ransomware kit for $20 online and create your own virus. So
what are we doing here, Durgan? What are we doing here?
The question has been asked many times, I can assure you. But certainly, yeah, the barrier to entry is no longer that you've got to be a coder and so on. And people are obviously desperate at the moment to make money. Yeah. And therefore, you know, obviously it has just spiked, absolutely spiked. So just, yeah, the education is absolutely key for people to be aware of what a phishing email looks like, and just seeing the nuances of, you know, the extra character in the domain name, things that when we're all in a hurry, and frankly, I mean, I am in the office today because my internet at home is so slow, but you know, when we're outside of our business networks, where we have that extra layer of protection, or hopefully an extra layer of protection, and we've got distractions with children and dogs and everything going on around us, it's very, very, very easy just to click on a link and just crack on. So taking that extra moment just to verify.
Nice.
Absolutely, and I think desperation from all fronts, whether it be personal or indeed a business, you know, if there's a possible solution out there, people may not think about it as clearly as maybe they could. So, okay, thank you, Durgan. Did anyone else have any questions or anything to add? Okay, lovely. Durgan, thank you very much. It's good to know that obviously the support is out there, and good to understand what we can all be thinking of as well. I'll make sure that this video is hosted as well on our website, so that we can all come back to it if everyone's happy with that, and share it so that others can benefit as well. But I'd just like to say thank you very much to Durgan from CETSAT, which are part of the Somerset Cyber Group, and Chris as well. Chris is also with CETSAT, so thanks very much, Chris.
Thank you.
And I hope you've all benefited. Thank you very much, and all stay well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All the best.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.